You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of like clinical precision.
Right, yeah, like a clear-cut answer.
Exactly. You fall, your arm hurts, you go to the hospital, and the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen. The doctor points to it, and you have your answer.
Broken or not broken.
Yeah, it's clean, it's binary, and honestly, I mean, it's comforting. We really like things to be visible and easily categorized.
Oh, absolutely. The human brain, it completely craves that sort of linear problem solving. We want a clear problem, a clear diagnosis, and, a clear intervention.
But then you step into the world of global catastrophe response, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just shattered into 1,000 pieces.
Yeah, it's gone.
Right. We watch these massive disasters unfold on the news, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake leveling a city, or, a tsunami wiping out a
Or
coastline.
a sudden massive armed conflict that just displaces millions of people overnight.
Exactly. And from the outside, through our television screens, it just looks like pure, unfiltered chaos. We're looking at a diagnostic landscape of a broken world that is completely, well, murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. But the perception of pure chaos is actually kind of an illusion.
Wait, really? It looks pretty chaotic.
I know it does. But behind the scenes, operating beneath the rubble in the headlines, there is an incredibly meticulous, heavily debated, and intensely structured science to managing that catastrophe.
So it's not just people running around trying to help?
Not at all. You look at the visual backdrop we've set up today for you, a bustling, map-filled emergency operations center with data feeds and satellite imagery. That's the reality. There is this invisible architecture governing the response to, like, the worst days in human history.
Well, uncovering that invisible architecture is our mission for this deep dive, so welcome in.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're going to explore something you see frequently on the news, but rarely understand from the inside, which is how the global system actually mobilizes when a city or a whole country breaks.
Yeah, we're going to pull apart the highly structured frameworks that govern disaster response.
Right. We're going to dive deep into the agonizingly complex priorities for care when resources are practically non-existent. We're essentially looking at the operational rule books for the end of the world.
And, it's important to note that these rule books weren't drafted in comfortable academic offices.
No.
No, they represent decades of hard-learned, often really tragic lessons. The doctrines we'll be dissecting today were written in the blood and sweat of past crises.
Places where well-meaning interventions failed, right?
Exactly. Places where supply chains completely collapsed and where the international community realized that good intentions are, well, they're absolutely useless without a rigid, coordinated system.
Man, that's heavy. So let's start at the very top of that system because the logistics alone just boggle the mind.
Oh, they're massive.
I mean, when a massive earthquake hits, you instantly have dozens of foreign governments, hundreds of independent non-governmental organizations, local municipalities, and like various UN agencies all rushing toward the epicenter.
Yeah, all trying to help at the exact same time.
Right. I imagine the airspace alone is a nightmare. Without someone directing traffic, it seems like you just get a massive traffic jam of good intentions, where aid workers are literally tripping over each other.
Well, you're not wrong, because that traffic jam used to be a very real, very deadly problem.
Deadly, like because it slowed things down.
Yes, and because of misallocation. If you look back at crises in the late 90s or early 2000s, you would often see overlapping efforts in one town while the next town over literally starved.
Oh, wow. Just because everyone went to the most visible spot.
Exactly. The international community recognized this fatal flaw, which led to the 2005 humanitarian reform. Out of that reform came the overarching framework we use today.
And this is coordinated by the UN, right?
Yes, specifically the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCA.
OCHO.
Yeah. And the engine of OCH's coordination is something called the cluster approach.
Okay, let's pull the mechanism of that apart. I'm visualizing this like a pop-up city government.
That's a great way to look at it.
Right, because overnight, you need a water department, a health department, a housing authority. But instead of civil servants, these departments are staffed by a completely decentralized mix of international nonprofits, local actors, and, foreign medics who might not even speak the same language.
The pop-up government analogy is highly accurate, but it has a very specific hierarchy to prevent paralysis. The cluster approach divides the entire humanitarian response into specific operational sectors or clusters.
So like departments.
Exactly. You have a cluster for WASH, which is water, sanitation, and hygiene. You have a health cluster, a logistics cluster, a shelter cluster, and so on.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the mechanism that makes this actually work is accountability. Each of these clusters is assigned a designated lead agency.
So someone is actually the boss of that sector.
Right. The World Health Organization always leads the health cluster. UNICEF leads WASH and nutrition. The World Food Program leads logistics.
Meaning, if I'm a small independent medical NGO from Europe flying into a disaster zone, I don't just start setting up a tent wherever I feel like it.
Definitely not.
I have to report to the WHO, who is running the health cluster, and they tell me where the actual gaps are.
Precisely. And exactly how this plays out on the ground is literally the difference between life and death.
Yeah.
Before 2005, responses were often what we call capacity-driven.
Capacity-driven, what does that mean?
It means an NGO might have a massive warehouse full of winter coats, right?
Yeah.
And they have a donor base that wants to see action. So they charter a plane, fly into a disaster zone, and just start handing out coats.
Even if the disaster is like a tropical hurricane and the people actually need water purification tablets.
Exactly. They were letting their inventory dictate their intervention.
So it was supply pushing demand rather than demand pulling supply.
You nailed it. The cluster approach forces a radical shift from a capacity-driven response to a needs-based response. The lead agency maps the entire disaster area, assesses the actual epidemiological and survival needs of the population.
And then directs everyone based on that data.
Right. It directs the participating NGOs to fill those specific gaps. It prevents the black holes where nobody is providing sanitation, and it stops 5 different well-funded agencies from competing to hand out blankets in the same, highly visible neighborhood.
Man, that's brilliant. But operating in this environment requires adherence to a strict code of conduct. The source material outlines the 4 humanitarian principles that govern this work.
Yes. Humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence.
Okay, I want to dig into these because, they sound great on paper, but I have to imagine they are brutally difficult to maintain in the mud and the blood of an actual crisis.
Oh, they are constantly tested.
So, humanity means human suffering must be addressed wherever it's found. Impartiality means assistance is based solely on need, without any discrimination based on race, religion, or, political affiliation.
That's right. And then you hit the operational tripwires, which are neutrality and independence.
Tripwires, I like that.
Yeah, because neutrality dictates that humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature.
And independence.
Independence requires total autonomy from the political, economic, or military objectives of any actor in the region where the aid is being implemented.
Wait, I'm struggling to see how that actually works in the reality of modern conflict.
It's incredibly complicated.
If a massive earthquake hits a region that is actively controlled by a recognized terrorist organization or like a hostile rebel militia, how can a medical NGO truly stay independent?
Right.
If that militia controls all the roads, the seaports, and the checkpoints, you have to negotiate with them just to get your bandages and antibiotics to the victims. Doesn't the very act of negotiating compromise your neutrality?
This is the exact tightrope that humanitarian coordinators walk every single day. And it introduces this really crucial concept called humanitarian space.
Humanitarian space, is that a physical area?
Well, it's not just a physical zone, no. It's an operational environment where aid workers can function freely, safely, and without political interference.
Okay.
And to maintain that space, coordinators have to engage in what's called humanitarian deconfliction. You have to speak to the armed group controlling the checkpoint, but you do so strictly on the basis of the humanity principle.
So what does that conversation even sound like?
It sounds something like, we are moving 50 trucks of medical supplies to treat civilian casualties. We are not supplying your enemy, nor are we supplying you. We require safe passage.
But the optics of that, if you negotiate too closely or if you rely on that militia to escort your trucks for safety, the opposing side is going to look through their binoculars, see your white trucks rolling with their enemy's tanks, and suddenly you are perceived as a combatant.
Yes, and the moment you lose the perception of neutrality, the principle of distinction completely collapses.
Principle of distinction.
Under international humanitarian law, combatants must distinguish between military targets and civilian or humanitarian assets. If an NGO loses its neutral posture, its hospitals, its convoys, and its staff become legitimate military targets in the eyes of the belligerents.
Wow. That is a terrifying line to walk. So who actually sets up this physical space and runs these intense negotiations on day one? The texts mention these like initial response teams that drop in before the dust has even settled.
You're referring to the United Nations Disaster Assessment and Coordination Teams, or UNDAC.
Yeah, and DAC.
Got it. Yeah. These are elite, highly specialized professionals who are essentially on permanent standby globally. When a sudden onset emergency occurs, they deploy within 12 to 48 hours.
That is incredibly fast.
It has to be. And their primary job isn't to hand out food. Their job is to establish the On-Site Operations Coordination Center, the OSOCC.
Okay, so if I'm the local mayor of a ruined city or like a fire chief who has totally lost control of the situation, I'm looking for the OSOCC.
Exactly.
That's the physical hub, the pent with the satellite dishes and the whiteboards where the actual mapping of the chaos happens.
The OSOCC is the nerve center. And one of the most critical functions they manage in those early hours is INSARAG. That's the International Search and Rescue Advisory Group.
Oh, right. Because when an earthquake flattens a city, dozens of countries will send their urban search and rescue teams.
Yes, these are the people with the acoustic listening devices, the search dogs, the heavy concrete cutting saws.
And without INSARAG coordinating them.
Without INSARAG, 5 different international teams might spend 24 hours tunneling into the exact same collapsed hotel just because it's near the airport, while a collapsed school on the edge of town is completely ignored.
Right. So INSARAG divides the city into a grid, assigns specific blocks to the French team, the Mexican team, the Japanese team, and ensures total coverage. They bring the precision of an X-ray to a situation that has completely lost its structure.
They attempt to, yes. But here's the critical vulnerability in this entire civilian architecture.
What's that?
It relies on logistics. What happens when the earthquake or the conflict is so severe that the civilian infrastructure is completely erased?
Like there are no roads left.
Right. The bridges are gone, the airport runway is cratered, the port is underwater. The civilian NGOs, no matter how well-funded they are, they simply do not have the heavy lift capacity to move 500 tons of water purification equipment across a destroyed mountain pass.
And that's when you have to call in the military.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a logical solution. I mean, militaries have cargo planes, engineering battalions, helicopters. But based on our discussion about neutrality and humanitarian space, injecting heavily armed soldiers into a fragile disaster zone sounds like mixing oil and water.
It is an incredibly delicate science. It's governed by strict international frameworks. Specifically, we look at NATO's Allied Joint Doctrine for Humanitarian Assistance and the United Nations Oslo Guidelines.
And these guidelines dictate how foreign military and civil defense assets are used.
Exactly. And the bedrock of these guidelines is the principle of last resort.
Last resort, meaning militaries aren't the first phone call, they're the absolute final option.
Right.
I was thinking about this like using a sledgehammer to fix a watch. It's an incredibly powerful tool with massive capability, but you only swing it if the watch is trapped under a massive boulder and every other tool has snapped.
The sledgehammer analogy is perfect for capturing the blunt force capability of military logistics. The Oslo Guidelines are explicit about this. Military assets should only be requested when there is no comparable civilian alternative available.
Meaning the NGOs literally can't do it.
Right, and the humanitarian need has to be highly critical, meaning lives are in immediate jeopardy due to the logistical bottleneck. And lastly, the military involvement must be strictly time-limited.
So if a bridge is down and people are dying of thirst on the other side, the military is called in to build a pontoon bridge. But as soon as the civilian trucks can cross, the military needs to pack up and leave. They don't stick around to run the water distribution.
Exactly. And that brings us to the specific categories of military assistance outlined in the doctrine. There are 3 levels: direct, indirect, and infrastructure support.
Okay, let's break those down.
Direct assistance is face-to-face distribution. So a soldier physically handing a box of rations to a civilian, or a military medic providing primary care.
And indirect.
Indirect assistance involves transportation and logistics, using military cargo planes to fly civilian relief supplies to a staging area. And finally, infrastructure support encompasses repairing roads, fixing the power grid, or managing the airspace over the disaster zone.
Now think about your own neighborhood. If a tornado leveled your town right now, you'd probably expect the National Guard or the military to be driving down your street handing out bottled water.
Most people would, yes.
But as these guidelines show, in an international crisis, that direct assistance is actually the last thing the humanitarian community wants the military doing.
Oh, absolutely. The humanitarian community heavily prefers that militaries restrict themselves to indirect and infrastructural support.
And this goes back to humanitarian space, right?
Completely. If foreign military forces carrying weapons and wearing uniforms are seen distributing aid, the local population or armed factions operating in the area will inevitably start associating the civilian aid workers with the military forces.
The lines blur.
The lines disappear. And if the military eventually transitions into a combat role, or if they're perceived as an occupying force, the civilian NGOs who were standing next to them handing out water yesterday are suddenly viewed as collaborators today.
That makes total sense.
By keeping the military focused on building the bridge, which is infrastructure, or flying the planes, which is indirect, the civilian NGOs can handle the face-to-face distribution. This preserves their neutrality and protects their staff.
You know, the NATO doctrine features a fascinating graph illustrating the range of civil-military relationship. It maps out how this interaction changes based on the environment. Can we walk through the mechanism of that graph?
Of course. The graph is basically a spectrum dictated by the security environment. On the far left, you have a peacetime natural disaster, say, a devastating earthquake in a politically stable country with a functioning government.
Okay.
In this environment, the civil-military relationship is characterized by cooperation.
Cooperation. So they work together closely.
Very closely. The UN agencies, the local government, and foreign militaries can work hand in glove. They share information openly, they conduct joint planning meetings, and they maximize efficiency.
Because there's no enemy. The only enemy is the rubble.
Precisely. But as you move across the spectrum toward a complex emergency, perhaps an insurgency following a natural disaster or an active armed conflict, the relationship degrades from cooperation to what the doctrine calls coexistence.
Coexistence, man, that sounds incredibly cold. Just like try not to shoot each other and don't get in my way.
It is an intentional operational distancing. In a combat zone, the military's primary objective is defeating the enemy. The humanitarian objective is saving civilian lives, regardless of whose side they are on.
So the goals don't align.
These objectives are fundamentally misaligned. Therefore, in a state of coexistence, joint planning ceases. They communicate just enough to deconflict.
How does that work in practice?
The UN might send the military a map of NGO hospital coordinates and say, do not bomb these grids. Or they might negotiate a 2-hour pause in fighting to evacuate wounded. The goal is no longer maximizing efficiency. The goal is minimizing competition for resources and avoiding accidental targeting.
Wow. Okay, so once the OSAC is established, the clusters are assigned, the military has cleared the runway, and the airspace is deconflicted. You run into the next massive bottleneck.
Assessing the actual needs.
Right. You have a ruined city, hundreds of thousands of terrified people, and hundreds of aid trucks. How do you actually know what those people need? You can't just drive through the streets throwing bags of rice out the window. This requires a diagnostic tool for a whole society.
And this is where we turn to the Sphere Handbook.
The Sphere Handbook.
Yes. It is arguably the most important document in the humanitarian sector. It provides the gold standard frameworks for needs assessment and response analysis.
And the rule is you can't just guess what people need, right?
The fundamental principle is that you cannot guess. Every disaster is highly contextual. The Sphere Handbook forces responders to categorize the affected population, particularly through its settlement scenarios framework.
Right. The first major division they make is categorizing the population into non-displaced and displaced.
Exactly. If people are non-displaced, it means their homes are damaged, but they are staying on their property. Your logistical challenge is bringing the aid to them.
And if they are displaced?
If they are displaced, the framework breaks them down further into 2 critical subcategories: dispersed and communal.
Let's define those, because that's important. Dispersed means the refugees or displaced people are finding their own shelter. They might be renting apartments in a neighboring city, or they are being hosted by local families who took them in.
Yes.
And communal settlement is what we traditionally picture on the news, right? The massive, sprawling tent cities, the collective centers set up in football stadiums or planned refugee camps.
Now, human instinct and often political pressure pushes toward the communal response.
Really, why?
If a disaster completely wipes out a town, politicians and international donors usually want to find a big empty field, bulldoze it, set up 10,000 identical white tents, and put everyone behind a fence where they can easily be counted, fed, and photographed.
I mean, it seems highly efficient from a logistical standpoint. You bring the water trucks to one location. You set up one massive field hospital. So why does the Sphere Handbook treat communal camps as like a massive failure state? Why do they push so hard to support the dispersed populations instead?
Because the mechanism of a camp inherently strips human dignity and creates long-term catastrophe.
Long-term catastrophe.
Yes, camps are incredibly expensive to sustain. They pose massive public health risks. I mean, if cholera gets into a densely packed tent city, the mortality rate skyrockets. But most importantly, camps destroy self-reliance. They create a state of permanent dependency on international aid.
You essentially warehouse human beings.
You do. The Sphere standards dictate that the primary objective should be supporting existing host community structures. If 50,000 people flee a war zone and move into a neighboring town, don't build a camp outside the town.
What do you do instead?
Instead, provide cash assistance to the displaced families so they can pay rent to the locals. Provide construction materials to host families so they can expand their homes.
Because by doing that, you are injecting capital directly into the local economy. You are utilizing the existing municipal plumbing and electricity rather than trying to build a parallel system in a muddy field. You're maintaining social cohesion.
Exactly. And this ties directly into the overarching principle of do no harm. The Sphere Handbook is obsessed with the local market economy. Let me give you an example.
Yeah, please.
Let's say a hurricane wipes out a coastal region. An international NGO decides to import thousands of tons of free grain to feed the victims. They flood the zone with free food.
Which sounds incredibly generous.
It sounds generous, until you look at the mechanism of the local economy. What about the local farmers 10 miles inland who survived the hurricane? Their crops survived, but suddenly they can't sell any of their grain because the international community is giving it away for free. The local farmers go bankrupt, the local agricultural economy collapses, and when the NGO finally leaves a year later, there is no one left to grow food.
Wow. You've solved a short-term nutritional deficit but engineered a decade-long famine.
You fix the watch by smashing it with a sledgehammer. It's a recurring theme. The frameworks force you to look past the immediate visual tragedy and assess the cascading systemic impacts.
This systemic view has to be essential when a rapid onset emergency evolves into what they call a protracted crisis. The Sphere Handbook notes that the average duration of displacement globally is now measured in years, not months.
Which is a sobering fact. The framework dictates that the response must pivot from temporary life-saving measures to integrating with long-term development.
You can't just run diesel generators and drive water trucks into a community for 5 years. At some point, you have to transition to repairing the municipal power grid and fixing the underground water pipes.
Exactly. And this deep systemic analysis isn't just for infrastructure. It applies to vulnerable individuals as well. The minimum standards for child protection and humanitarian action, the CPMS, utilizes a socio-ecological model for analyzing risk and resilience.
Let's break down the mechanics of the socio-ecological model. How does a protection officer actually apply that in a ruined city?
It requires looking at the child through concentric circles of influence. You don't just look at the child in a vacuum and ask, are they physically injured?
You could look broader.
Right. First, you assess the individual level, their age, their sex, their physical health. Then you step out to the family level. Are they separated from their parents? Is there domestic violence occurring in their temporary shelter?
Okay, that's the second ring.
Then you step out to the community level. Has their school been destroyed? Are there safe spaces to play? And finally, the societal level. Has the legal system collapsed, exposing them to child labor or trafficking?
Because a child might have zero physical injuries. But if the societal ring has collapsed and armed rebel groups are patrolling their neighborhood looking for recruits, that child is in imminent lethal danger.
Their vulnerability is astronomically high, even if their medical chart is totally clear. And the CPMS sources contain a fascinating, almost counterintuitive warning about assessing these risks. They explicitly caution about the dangers of the assessment process itself.
You mean the danger of just asking questions?
Yeah. Data collection in a crisis zone can be lethal. The CPMS mandates that agencies must identify unintended harm caused by the data collection process.
How could collecting data be lethal?
Well, imagine you are a well-meaning protection officer walking through a displacement camp with a clipboard, asking families if they have witnessed gender-based violence or if they know which children have been forcibly recruited by armed groups.
Oh, I see. If the people running the camp or informants for those armed groups see you asking those questions and see a family talking to you,
Yeah.
you've just put a target on that family's back.
Exactly. The mere act of gathering the data creates a life-threatening risk for the subjects.
Which forces agencies to balance their need for accurate data against the imperative to keep the population safe. Sometimes you have to operate on broader assumptions rather than granular data if acquiring that data violates the do no harm principle.
The tragic reality of it.
So the overarching theme here is that assessing the macro level needs of the city, the economy, or the population requires incredible sensitivity to the existing ecosystem. You have to thread the needle to avoid causing secondary disasters.
Absolutely.
But what happens when we zoom all the way in? Assessing a city's plumbing or a child's societal risk is one thing, but when individuals start arriving at the medical tents in droves, bleeding, crushed, suffocating, the frameworks have to shift from these broad societal assessments to intensely intimate clinical ones.
And this transition pulls us into the most harrowing and ethically complex frameworks in the entire humanitarian sector. We are opening the World Health Organization's Red Book and the Sphere Health Standards. This is where policy meets physiology.
We're talking about the impossible math, medical triage, and priorities for care in an environment where everything is scarce.
The primary goal of any health response during a crisis is coldly defined as preventing and reducing excess mortality and morbidity. That is the North Star. To understand when international action is mandated, the WHO uses specific mathematical emergency thresholds.
The baseline triggers. The texts detail the crude mortality rate, or CMR, and the under 5 crude mortality rate, the U5 CMR.
Right. A declared public health emergency is triggered when the crude mortality rate exceeds 1 death per 10,000 people per day.
And for kids.
For the most vulnerable population, children under 5, the threshold is 2 deaths per 10,000 children per day.
Let's do the math on that so we can really grasp the scale. If you have a displaced population of 100,000 people who have fled a conflict zone into a neighboring region, a CMR of 1 per 10,000 means that if more than 10 people in that population are dying every single day from disease, exposure, or injury, you are officially in a severe emergency.
Yes.
It seems like a small number, 10 out of 100,000, but compounded daily, it represents a catastrophic failure of the survival ecosystem.
It is a grim mathematical trigger. But that math becomes deeply personal when the casualties actually arrive at the gates of a field hospital. During a mass casualty incident, whether from an earthquake aftershock or a bombing, the hospital will be overwhelmed in minutes.
And to manage this, the medical staff utilize a rigid 5-color triage system.
Triage is essentially an emotionally brutal sorting algorithm. Math and medical reality have to completely override human instinct.
Because if you are a doctor or a nurse, your instinct, your entire training, is to save the person bleeding in front of you.
Right. But in triage, you might have to walk past 3 screaming people to treat someone who is quiet. You have to fundamentally suppress your clinical instinct to treat the first person you see.
So the tags dictate the workflow. Red is the absolute highest priority.
Yes. These are patients with life-threatening injuries like tension pneumothorax or severe arterial bleeding who require immediate intervention. But crucially, they are salvageable with the resources on hand.
Okay, what about yellow?
Yellow is medium priority. These patients have severe injuries, perhaps a compound fracture, but they are physiologically stable enough to wait an hour or two without dying.
Green is the walking wounded, right?
Exactly. Minor lacerations, sprains, they can wait a day if necessary. And gray is deceased.
And then there is the blue category. Reading the WHO Red Book's protocols on the blue category was incredibly heavy. It is the darkest corner of disaster medicine.
The blue category is the starkest representation of scarce resources. A blue tag is assigned to a patient who has signs of life, but whose injuries are so severe that they are beyond the technical capacity of the field facility.
Or
they require such a massive expenditure of time, personnel, and blood products to FAVE that treating them would guarantee the deaths of multiple red category patients who are waiting.
let's run a hypothetical on that, just to really make it clear. You have a patient, maybe even a young child, who has severe traumatic brain injury from a collapsed building. They need 6 hours of complex neurosurgery, a ventilator, and 10 units of blood. But outside the tent, you have 15 people with treatable severe bleeding, and you only have 1 surgeon and 5 units of blood total.
In a state-of-the-art hospital in London or New York, that child is rushed to the operating room. In a disaster zone, under the triage framework, the ethical choice, the required choice, is to tag that child blue.
Wow.
The framework dictates doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. You cannot expend your entire surgical capability on one patient with a 10% chance of survival, while 15 patients with a 90% chance of survival bleed to death in the hallway.
How does a medical professional reconcile that? How does the team look at the family or look at themselves and square that decision with the humanitarian principle of humanity, the mandate that human suffering must be addressed?
Because blue does not mean abandonment. This is a critical misconception. Finding a blue tag requires a shift in the philosophy of care. The mechanism of treatment changes from curative to palliative.
Meaning keeping them comfortable.
Yes, you dedicate a nurse or a social worker to provide heavy pain relief, warmth, and dignity. You address their suffering, but you accept that you cannot reverse their mortality. It is an excruciating burden for the medical staff, but is the only way the system doesn't collapse entirely.
And the frameworks don't just change the ethics of care, they change the actual physical mechanics of trauma surgery, depending on the disaster. The Red Book makes a massive distinction between the physiology of a natural disaster and the physiology of armed conflict.
The mechanism of injury dictates the response. In a major earthquake, the predominant trauma involves crush injuries from masonry. You're dealing with complex fractures and, crucially, crush syndrome.
What's crush syndrome?
It's where trapped muscle tissue dies and releases toxins into the bloodstream, requiring massive amounts of IV fluids and dialysis to prevent kidney failure. But in an armed conflict, the physics change entirely. The WHO Red Book notes a massive shift toward high-velocity penetrating trauma.
Gunshot wounds, shrapnel from artillery, blast over pressure.
Yes, and that completely alters the basic ABCs of trauma care. Anyone who has taken a basic first aid or CPR class knows the algorithm. A, B, C, airway, breathing, circulation. You check if their airway is clear, you check if their lungs are moving, then you check their pulse.
But in a conflict zone, the protocol shifts to C, A, B, C, D, E.
They add a little C to the front of the algorithm.
What does that little C stand for in practice?
The little C stands for catastrophic peripheral hemorrhage. Decades of statistical evidence from combat zones demonstrate that the most common preventable cause of death is exsanguination, bleeding out from a shattered limb due to high-velocity weaponry.
Because the physics of a rifle round create a massive temporary cavity in the tissue, tearing major arteries.
Exactly. So if a patient comes in with a shattered femur from a gunshot, you don't even look at their face to check their airway first.
You don't.
You don't have the time. If you spend 15 seconds clearing their airway and positioning their neck, they will bleed to death on the table while you are doing it. The protocol dictates that the absolute first action is applying a tourniquet high and tight on the limb to stop the catastrophic bleed. Once the plumbing is clamped, then you move to the airway, breathing, and circulation.
The Red Book also heavily details a concept called damage control surgery, which again flies in the face of what we expect from modern medicine. You don't go into a field hospital tent and expect a surgeon to spend 12 hours perfectly reconstructing a shattered pelvis with titanium plates.
Far from it. The goal of damage control surgery is not to fix the patient. The goal is to stop the patient from dying. Major trauma triggers a physiological cascade known as the lethal triad: hypothermia, acidosis, and coagulopathy.
Coagulopathy means the blood stops clotting, right?
Right. If you keep a trauma patient on an operating table for 4 hours trying to perfectly repair their bowel, the trauma of the surgery itself will push them into the lethal triad and they will die.
So what is the abbreviated procedure? How do they actually execute damage control?
It is strictly limited to hemorrhage and contamination control. The surgeon opens the abdomen, clamps or ties off the bleeding arteries, and staples off the perforated sections of the bowel, so intestinal contents stop spilling and causing sepsis.
But they don't fix it permanently.
No. They don't reconnect the bowel. They often don't even close the abdominal wall fully. They might leave it open, temporarily covered with a sterile dressing. The surgery might take 45 minutes.
And then what?
The patient is then rushed to the ICU to get warm, get blood transfusions, and correct their physiological derangements. Definitive, perfect anatomical repairs have to wait days until the patient is stable enough to survive a longer surgery, or until they can be evacuated to a higher level facility.
It's triage applied to the scalpel itself. You're doing the minimum viable intervention to keep the machine running. So triage and damage control surgery handle that initial overwhelming influx of kinetic trauma, the golden hour. But the source materials point out that as the hours turn into days, the disaster doesn't stop. It evolves. The responders have to activate frameworks for specialized, often invisible threats.
We move out of the purely surgical phase and into the complex systemic vulnerabilities of the population. And one of the most terrifying frameworks outlined in the WHO Red Book deals with the introduction of CBRN events into a disaster space.
CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear events. This is the nightmare scenario.
It really is.
Imagine an earthquake ruptures a major chemical manufacturing plant. Or in a conflict zone, a belligerent deploys a nerve agent like sarin gas, or a choking agent like chlorine.
The framework for a CBRN event radically alters the medical response, particularly regarding the safety of the emergency medical team. If a patient arrives at the field hospital having been exposed to a chemical agent, the standard dictates the absolute necessity of decontamination outside the medical facility.
This goes back to the ethical math we discussed. Because if a mother carries her child, who has been exposed to a chemical agent, into the triage tent.
The agent off-gases from their clothing. It enters the ventilation of the tent. It contaminates the triage nurses, the surgeons, the equipment, and the other highly vulnerable patients.
It becomes a secondary weapon.
Exactly. The WHO guidance is incredibly stark in this scenario. If a patient with a CBRN exposure cannot be safely decontaminated in a specialized washdown area outside, they can only be allowed into the facility. The safety of the EMT personnel must come first.
You essentially have to lock the doors on a dying patient.
You do, because the mechanism of failure is total. If a surgeon breathes in that nerve agent and goes down, they aren't just one casualty. You have instantly lost the ability to perform surgery on hundreds of other people. The safety of the responders is the linchpin that preserves the integrity of the entire response network. If the hospital falls, the community dies.
That is just chilling, the weight of that responsibility. But not all specialized threats are quite that dramatic or cinematic. I want to shift to something that really surprised me in the SPHERE standards. When we think of disasters, we think of explosions, collapsing buildings, and bleeding. But SPHERE puts a massive emphasis on managing non-communicable diseases, or NCDs.
Yes, things like asthma, diabetes, hypertension, and cardiovascular disease.
Consider the mechanism of a modern city. A 7.8 earthquake doesn't just knock down residential high-rises, it destroys the pharmacies. It severs the supply chains that bring insulin into the city. It destroys the dialysis machines at the local clinics.
Right. It's like surviving a horrific tumbling car crash, crawling out of the wreckage without a scratch, only to realize you left your life-saving asthma inhaler inside the burning vehicle.
The disaster doesn't stop when the ground stops shaking. If you have type 1 diabetes and the health system collapses, you have maybe a week before you go into diabetic ketoacidosis. It is a lethal, silent emergency.
And it requires a massive logistical pivot from the health cluster.
Yeah.
Delivering insulin isn't like delivering bandages. Insulin requires a cold chain. It must be kept refrigerated.
How do you maintain a pharmaceutical cold chain in a city where the power grid is completely destroyed and the temperatures are 100 degrees?
You have to bring in solar-powered refrigerators just to keep the existing NCD patients alive. The SPHERE standards emphasize that establishing protocols for these NCDs must happen immediately alongside the trauma response to prevent a massive secondary wave of mortality.
Wait, let me look at this from a resource allocation perspective. With so much physical trauma happening, thousands of people with crush injuries requiring massive surgeries and blood transfusions, how on earth does a health coordinator find the personnel, the time, or the money to prioritize chronic issues like blood pressure or even mental health? Don't you have to put all your cheeks on the surgical tables?
If you put all your chips on the surgical tables, the secondary wave of mortality will eclipse the initial trauma wave within a month.
Really? That fast?
Yes. They manage this by strictly enforcing the integrated health systems approach we discussed at the very beginning with the cluster system. The trauma surgeons in the red category tents are not the ones managing the diabetes patients. The primary healthcare infrastructure is being reestablished parallel to the trauma care.
So while the surgical NGOs are doing damage control on the gunshot wounds, other NGOs are setting up primary care clinics in the displaced persons camps to refill prescriptions and handle maternal care.
Precisely. And they integrate mental health and psychosocial support directly into that basic primary care. They don't fly in hundreds of psychiatrists. They train the general nurses and community health workers to recognize acute trauma, severe depression, or psychosis in the primary care setting.
It ensures that the invisible wounds are treated without pulling resources away from the surgical theater.
It's a holistic ecosystem, which brings us to another highly vulnerable population that requires specialized, non-medical intervention: unaccompanied children.
Oh man, the child protection minimum standards have a whole operational framework for this. In the chaos of a midnight earthquake or a sudden military offensive, children are frequently separated from their families in the panic.
The CPMS mandates intensive case management for these unaccompanied and separated children. But just like the surgical tents, the caseworkers are overwhelmed, so they must employ a triage system of their own. Cases are prioritized based on capacity, urgency, and the ability to take action.
Categorizing the children into high, medium, and low risk. Let's run a scenario on that. How do you categorize a lost child?
An infant found alone in the rubble, or a young girl found wandering near a zone known for armed group recruitment, is categorized as high risk. They require immediate life-saving intervention, secure shelter, and round-the-clock monitoring.
And a lower risk.
Conversely, a 16-year-old boy who became separated from his parents during a flood but is currently staying safely with an uncle or a known neighbor in an adjacent village might be categorized as low or medium risk.
Because the 16-year-old has a protective societal ring around him, going back to that socio-ecological model, the caseworker can put his file a little further down the stack to focus on the infant who has no protective rings.
Exactly. You allocate your human resources where the threat to life and safety is most acute. The frameworks also highlight a critical shift in maternal and child health during the protracted phase.
What do they shift to?
The priorities narrow to establishing safe referral systems for obstetric emergencies. You need a dedicated pathway to identify a woman in obstructed labor in a camp and transport her to a facility capable of an emergency C-section. And simultaneously, you have to implement aggressive protocols for acutely malnourished children.
Why the intense focus on the malnourished kids? Obviously, starvation is bad, but how does it interact with the medical frameworks?
Because malnutrition completely suppresses the immune system. In a refugee camp environment, an acutely malnourished child doesn't usually die of starvation, they die of a secondary infection.
Like what?
A basic case of measles, or a diarrheal disease like cholera, which a healthy child might survive with some fluids, becomes an absolute death sentence for a malnourished child. The framework dictates treating the malnutrition aggressively with therapeutic foods as a preventative measure to stop the infectious disease mortality rate from spiking.
Everything is about anticipating the next cascade of failures. If X happens, we must block Y. Which leads me to the final and perhaps most culturally sensitive, specialized framework we need to discuss. The source texts dive into a topic that is surrounded by a lot of fear and misinformation: the management of dead bodies.
It's a pervasive and incredibly stubborn myth that dead bodies after a natural disaster cause massive epidemics. You constantly hear calls to quickly bulldoze mass graves to prevent disease.
Right, that's what you always hear.
But from a purely epidemiological standpoint, the WHO and SPHERE standards are clear. Victims of natural disasters generally do not harbor epidemic-causing pathogens that they didn't already have while alive. The bacteria involved in human decomposition do not cause cholera or typhoid.
So, rushing to dispose of the deceased in mass, unmarked graves, doesn't actually save the living from disease, but it does cause immense harm in other ways.
It causes catastrophic psychosocial harm. The frameworks emphasize that the management of the deceased is deeply intertwined with public health, but from the perspective of human dignity and community recovery.
So what should they do instead?
Identifying the deceased, storing them properly in refrigerated containers or temporary, clearly marked individual graves, and allowing families to perform culturally appropriate mourning rituals is essential.
It's not just about clearing debris for sanitation. If a mother doesn't know for certain that her son is dead, if he was just swept into an unmarked mass grave by a bulldozer, she lives in a permanent state of ambiguous loss. She can't grieve. The community can't heal.
And there are legal implications too.
Right. From a legal standpoint, widows might not be able to claim property, or orphans might not be able to access benefits without a death certificate. Treating the dead with respect and meticulous identification is quite literally a foundational step for the living to rebuild their society.
The entire architecture of disaster response, whether it's the cluster approach, the military logistics, the medical triage, or the management of the deceased, is ultimately designed to preserve the social fabric of the affected population.
We have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. We started way up at the 30,000-foot view with the massive geopolitical coordination of the UN's OCHA and the brilliant, if complex, cluster approach.
Yes, and we examined the strict last resort doctrines governing NATO and military assets and how they maintain the delicate invisible borders of humanitarian space.
Then we move down into the rubble to understand how the sphere standards use settlement scenarios and how the CPMS uses socio-ecological models to assess the actual needs of a population, ensuring that well-meaning aid doesn't inadvertently destroy the local economy or put vulnerable people at greater risk through poor data collection.
And finally, we zoomed all the way down into the surgical tent. We looked at the heartbreakingly precise color-coded triage tags, the shift to CABCDE trauma protocols in conflict zones, and the agonizing ethical math required to manage scarce resources when you simply cannot save everyone.
It is a remarkable, deeply sobering, and highly evolved architecture. And for you listening, I think there's a profound takeaway here, whether you ever find yourself working in a humanitarian crisis or not.
I agree.
While these frameworks are built for the most extreme global catastrophes, the underlying principles are universally applicable. Shifting from what you want to provide to what your community actually needs, establishing clear, math-based triage when your team is completely overwhelmed, and prioritizing the principle of do no harm above your own desire to look like a hero. These are absolute masterclasses in managing chaos in any field, any business, or any community organization.
The mechanics of managing chaos are universal. But I'd like to leave everyone with a final, broader thought to ponder.
Okay, let's hear it.
As we look to the future, these frameworks were largely built around the concept of emergencies. Sudden, abnormal events that require a temporary, massive influx of international response until the affected country can restore normalcy.
You swoop in, you stabilize, and you hand it back.
Exactly. But as climate change accelerates, creating more frequent extreme weather events, and as global urbanization creates massive megacities in hazard-prone coastal and seismic areas, crises are becoming inherently more complex and protracted.
So they aren't temporary anymore.
Right. So the vital question for the next decade of humanitarian reform is this: how will these carefully balanced frameworks adapt when the abnormal emergency becomes the permanent, everyday reality for major parts of the globe? If a region is constantly battered by compounding disasters, will the very concept of a temporary humanitarian response become entirely obsolete?
Man, that is a staggering thought. It makes you realize that the diagnostic muddy waters we started talking about aren't clearing up anytime soon. We finally learned how to read the complex X-ray of a disaster zone, but the patient's underlying condition is changing faster than the medical books can be rewritten. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us, and we'll see you next time.